Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to the first one-hour edition of This Week in Northern California. We begin with our news panel. Joining me are Tom Vacar, consumer editor for KTVU News on high-speed rail funding; Scott Shafer, host of the California Report on KQED Public Radio on Proposition 8 trial; John Wildermuth, writer with Fox and Hounds Daily on the Redistricting Commission; and Lance Williams, senior reporter with California Watch on the use of stimulus funds for a project in Napa. Tom Vacar, we begin with you. The $2.25 billion that California is going to get from President Obama sounds like really good news. Now, that means that California is getting about a quarter of all the money that's being distributed nationally. Why?
Need, power, and patronage. That's the easiest way to put it. It is obviously something California and many other states need, and many other states are participating in this. Certainly power, California is a very important state politically, always will be. And finally, patronage. We are a big accounts receivable to many political people, and as a result they feel they have to do this, and obviously we're a very important state. Having said all of that, the idea is to provide a down payment, $2.25 billion. That allows from Prop 1A funds that were passed a couple of years ago for us to go out and get another equal amount of money. So now we're getting kind of in the $5 billion range, but it's a down payment on a $40 billion project. 520 miles of rail that will initially go from San Francisco to Anaheim, so basically SF to LA. Ultimately, it will then be expanded all the way to Sacramento and San Diego, and then maybe some spurs off of that. But the idea is to try to create a high-speed rail system that will be competitive with, obviously, the airline industry, but also try to create a great new transportation system within California that should result in lots of jobs.
Tom, the president made a big deal about shovel-ready projects. Are there going to be any shovels and dirt turning as a result of this money?
Well, that's what's really interesting. The conditions of this are very, very clear. You actually have to start building this thing by September 2012. If not, you don't get the money. And it has to be accomplished very much quickly after that. 2017 is the target date. It could be as late as 2020 for the primary thing. But when you think about what we're talking about, the span, the scope, and all of this stuff, this is an enormous public works project, probably the biggest ever in the state of California, and one of the biggest in the history of the United States. So as a result, it is a very, very powerful incentive to do this, or you lose the money.
Are they going to call this like tracks to nowhere? I mean, it's not going to hook up with anything.
Well, it is eventually going to hook up with something. That's going to be two major metropolitan areas, but how you do that at the ends and all of the problems getting to those ends, not so much in the middle of the state where the right-of-way is there and pretty easy, but when you start getting in these urban areas, you're going to see some fights the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time.
Well, one of the things is that, you know, even after the state passed the $9.9 billion bond measure, you've heard a lot of people in Sacramento saying, well, we can't sell those bonds. The state really can't afford to do this. Getting this money from the feds, $2.25 million, $2.3 billion, this really means there's not a lot you can say in Sacramento except let's go, right?
Well, the problem is, of course, the state has the worst credit rating in the nation, so whatever we do in selling bonds and raising this money, we're going to pay through the teeth for it. But let me talk to you about the jobs, because I think that's what's really interesting, because that seems to be the thing on everybody's mind. It is estimated that there will be 160,000 construction jobs that come from this, 34,000 of them alone from the San Francisco-San Jose route. Just in that piece of territory, there will be 34,000 jobs. And if all goes as planned, it'll be 450,000 permanent jobs after construction. That is a big number of jobs in the state of California.
Now, with all of the joy around getting this $2 billion plus amount, the governor asked for even more than that, didn't he?
Yeah, he wanted twice that amount of money because he figured he could double down. He's got $9 billion in this Prop 1A, so he could have gotten all of that money, and that would go a long way to do this. But remember, we're talking about a $30 to $40 billion project, so funding it, making sure we have the funds, how we're going to do the funding mechanism, how much private money might have to come into this, all of these things are undecided. And then there are other really major issues. For example, a lot of people in the peninsula, while they support very much the idea of high-speed rail, don't want it above ground. You put it underground, it gets a lot more expensive, a lot more complicated. All of these things still have to be worked out. So if we really want this money, if we really want to do this project, we have to decide pretty quick.
You said private money might come in. Do you have a sense of what that might look like?
who knows? It might be something as simple as a bond, private guys coming in buying certain kinds of bonds. Maybe special bonds would be created. It's not really clear how all of that's going to happen, but there's an impetus that happens here. Once you get this thing going and people see that it's working, then they will be excited about doing that in the chance to make money. The other problem that really threatens this is the inability, the continuing, nagging, unfailing inability of this state to get its financial house in order. That could hurt this project more than anything, because people are going to say, why do I want to even buy these bonds if these people aren't going to figure out how to do their budgets? That is a real threat here. And again, the good news for Californians, the average Joe Californian, the you and me's of the world who say, why can't they make a decision? If they don't make this decision, we're going to lose that money.
Yeah.
Tom, is there a prospect for money for the so-called rail box in downtown San Francisco?
There's a chance to raise money for all of these things, because ultimately it could all be integrated. So there is going to be money available for those kinds of things. Exactly where it comes from is still unknown. The primary goal here is to get this project started, to start laying tracks, to start electrifying things, to do all the things that you need to do. And if that alone happens, then there's going to be a lot of benefit here to the Bay Area.
Now, the airlines are not going to sit on their hands either. Undoubtedly, this is a big threat to them while all this is happening.
It has the potential to be a big threat to them, provided that people take the train. That's the other problem with this, is that public transit, train transit, there's very little of it in the world that isn't publicly subsidized, and there's no reason to believe that this is going to make it on its own. There's no way it can make it on its own given these prices. So there will be public subsidies, but the airlines will have something to compete with, and all of us could benefit from that. How we will benefit will really have a lot to do with how much the public supports it and how much they actually use the system.
Okay, well, at the same time that you're talking about good news coming there, you're in the beginning of a real process that could bring reality to the dream of the train. We're midways, another story, Scott, that you're covering, and that is the Proposition 8 trial that's been going on here in federal court. It's reached a stop point right now, not the end, but a pause. So there was dramatic testimony this week from the defense. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yep, this is the defense. They're defending Proposition 8 against this challenge, saying that from plaintiffs saying that Prop 8 is unconstitutional based on the U.S. Constitution. No trial has ever challenged a same-sex marriage ban on that basis. And this week, there were only two witnesses that the defense called throughout the whole trial, and both of them were on the stand this week. Probably the most contentious, the most interesting in some ways was David Blankenhorn, who's the president of the Institute for American Values. And his point, he was like the star witness for them in a way, and his whole testimony was focused on the reason for marriage. Why do we have marriage? Looking back historically over centuries and cultures, and what would be the implications of changing the definition of marriage to allow same-sex couples. And his fundamental premise was that marriage is intended primarily to nurture bonds between biological mothers and fathers and their children, and that same-sex marriage simply can't do that because you don't have two biological parents. David Boies, who is the attorney, one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs, gave a very withering cross-examination of him and got him to acknowledge a number of things which were very helpful to the plaintiffs, including the fact that gay couples and their children would benefit from gay marriage, as well as the fact that he, in previous writings, seemed to endorse the idea of same-sex marriage. So there was some good give and take, but it was very dramatic, and you really got a sense of David Boies, who is one of these two high-profile attorneys, why he makes the money he does. He is dogged and very tough.
And he was a surprise attorney for this trial.
Well, one of the reasons this trial has gotten so much attention is because of these two attorneys. David Boies and Ted Olson were on opposite sides of the Bush v. Gore case in 2000 that Olson won for the Republicans, making President Bush the winner of that election. So they're coming together now to fight Proposition 8 to support gay marriage. And he was on the cover of Newsweek last week, I believe it was, Ted Olson, talking about the conservative case for marriage. So it's kind of a, unlikely political bedfellows, strange bedfellows kind of a story that's added a lot of drama to the trial.
Well, one of the things that the people challenging Prop 8 are trying to do is, don't they have to show that gays should be a protected group? That they're trying to say that the gay community doesn't have power. And isn't that a tough thing to do in California, at least?
Well, one of the witnesses this week was Kenneth Miller, the other defense witness, and his purpose for being there was to show how much power the gay community has. And they pointed, in fact, to Proposition 8. The gay community and their allies raised $43 million to defeat Prop 8. They failed, but a powerless group, he said, could hardly pull together the resources to raise that much money. But on cross-examination, he also acknowledged that throughout the country, the gay community has been the target of a lot of probably more ballot measures than any other group in the country over the past couple of decades to take rights away. And so they kind of battled it out on that front. But to your point, one of the issues that they're trying to, one of the grounds on which this could be thrown out would be if, like the state Supreme Court, Judge Vaughn Walker, the federal judge in this case, decides that gays and lesbians should be protected, that sexual orientation should be protected the way race, gender, and religion are also protected by the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. That's a reach. And it doesn't have to be struck down on that basis. It could also be, he could also decide that it was just discriminatory, that it was rooted in discrimination and bias. They put a lot of information into evidence showing the messages that were given to voters that were very much based on prejudice and stereotypes. So it's a Vaughn Walker, if he rules in favor of the plaintiffs, has to know that this is going to go up on appeal almost immediately. And so if he writes a decision, some are saying that the best decision would be very narrow, a narrow decision that would be harder to strike down.
And what happens next? Where are we?
Well, there's a sort of a 30-day timeout. Both sides have 30 days to submit more documents to the court. There'll be some more amicus briefs submitted by friends, although the judge himself said, I don't know if we really need any more information. But 30-day timeout, and then he'll just set closing arguments probably for sometime in late March, early April.
And is this when he reviews those videotapes?
He's going to look at the videotapes after the closing arguments. Yes, exactly.
Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Well, that was one proposition, Proposition 8, but now we turn to another proposition, Proposition 11, that the voters also passed, that creates a citizens commission to draw the district lines for our state legislature. Well, the application process is supposed to be open, it's supposed to be encouraging, but something has not worked. What?
Well, one of their main concerns right now is that they're getting lots of people putting their applications in. It's heading on to 8,000 people, but they are really, really short of people of color. I mean, basically 3/4 of the people that have actually submitted their applications are white. I mean, for example, the 37% of the population is Latino in California, and only about 9% of the people who submitted applications for this commission are white. Asians, about 12%. They're at about 4% right now. Blacks are pretty much equal to what their representation is in the state. But overall, the question is, you got 8,000 people, they want more representation, they want more minority representation, but at the end of the day, we're talking about 14 slots.
Let's go back on the Latinos, 37% in the population, but only 9%?
About 9% have applied.
Gone.
And the application procedure is really easy. It's just online, and basically you don't have much information to put in. Your name, and then you have to answer some questions. Have you ever won an elective office? Have you ever worked for a politician? Have you belonged to the same party for the last 5 years? And if all that stuff is fine, then you're just on the list.
It's not easy. You're talking about some first-generation families here. So to say you voted in the last, whatever, 5 elections?
2 of the last 3
statewide
statewide elections.
And that you, what was the other requirement?
Other requirement is that you or your wife or your kids haven't worked for a politician, haven't contributed more than, I think, $2,200 in a year to a politician or a political campaign.
No. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Those numbers you talked about are actually very similar to the electorate. I mean, California is a majority-minority state, and yet the electorate is about 70% white. So it's a similar kind of a problem, is who's involved in the political process in California. It's not a very diverse, it certainly isn't as diverse as the population as a whole.
No, and that's, one of the problems. I mean, it's one thing to say, Latinos are 37% of the population, but you're right, they're not 37% of the typical voting population. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen is there's going to be 8,000 or more, and then the state auditor general is just going to kind of cut this down to 60. 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and 20 decline to state or others. And then through a magical process, which is going to be back and forth, we'll end up with a commission that has 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 decline to state or other parties.
And probably 200 lawsuits all along the way.
Well, you're already starting to see this because some people supported by the Democratic Party are already working on a ballot measure that would say, this can never represent the state of California, so let's just toss it out and let the legislature do it all over again.
But to Tom's point, are there lawsuits being filed already to, sort of preempt all this or toss it out if it doesn't reflect the state? I mean, on what basis could they do that?
You can always, well, the law itself says it should reflect the state, but it doesn't set any hard and fast guidelines for what reflects the state. But, can you file a lawsuit? Sure. If you have a filing fee, you can always file a lawsuit. But you really can't file much yet because nothing's happened yet. Until February 12th, when the application time actually closes, we really don't know how it's going to turn out.
John, stepping back, are you optimistic that we're going to have a fairer and a better redistricting process? And are we going to have a legislature that can actually get some traction on our problems, or is this just...
There's no guarantees about that. I mean, the whole idea of, one of the ideas of changing this was to make it more competitive. The idea being that, a seat with a Republican and a Democrat fighting out, there has to be a middle ground and people from the extremes are less likely to win. But the problem is that much of the way that the state is set up politically is just by where people decide to move. You can do whatever you want, but you're not going to be able to create a Republican seat in the Bay Area. You're probably not going to be able to get many Democratic seats in Orange County, Riverside, or San Bernardino. There's just nothing you can do. It might make it fair. It certainly will take the politics out where a Democratic legislature decides we're going to line this up so that Democrats win, but it's not going to be perfect.
Is the possible solution recognizing that this whole idea of districting is probably impossible, and that maybe what really should happen is that everybody should run for state government at large?
Just think of the cost. More than anything else, if I'm an assemblyman from Redding and I'm going to have to run a campaign attracting people from LA and San Diego, it just isn't going to happen.
What are these 14 people going to do? I mean, how long a process is it? They have to move to Sacramento for a period of time?
It's going to be, they're probably going to have meetings around the state, and they're going to be paid, I think, on a daily basis, so much per meeting. But it's going to be pretty much a full-time job. What they are going to do is they're going to make the decisions. They're not going to be out there on a table drawing lines. They're going to hire pros to actually do that. But when the decisions come down and the decisions have to be made, it's going to be, they're going to say, this is the one we like, this is the one we don't like.
And who will decide who the pros will be that they will hire?
It's a good question.
It's a good question. But they're going to serve for how long?
Actually, their terms are 10 years. But realistically, 99% of their job is going to be done by September 2011.
Okay, what seemed like a simple choice on the ballot turned out to be more complicated as usual than things are. Lance, your story also seemed like pretty simple and straightforward when we first heard about it from some pretty high-profile people in Washington, but not that simple. Can you tell me, this story is about the Napa wine train getting stimulus money. Did the wine train get stimulus money? If not, who did?
There's a flood control project, Belva. People in Napa have a need for protection against the wintertime flooding. The Corps of Engineers has an innovative design, and the toughest part of the job is relocating a bunch of infrastructure in downtown Napa that is used by the Napa Valley Wine Train, a private business and a popular tourist attraction. That's what the $54 million in stimulus funding is going to. At California Watch, the Center for Investigative Reporting project where I work, we were looking at stimulus funding and how this contract came to be let. Previous phases of this flood control project were put out to competitive bid. You guys know, experts say that's a way to control costs. But for this phase, the Corps of Engineers sought out a corporation whose shareholders are up in the outback of western Alaska. They're called an Alaska Native Corporation. And under federal law to right the wrongs of the past, they have special access to federal contracts, including the ability to get a unlimited size federal contracts without competitive bidding.
Who was it that said we need to hire a company from the Alaskan outback to do this? I mean, how does that happen?
Well, the Corps explains that if you want to get something done fast, you want to negotiate a contract with a sole source company. And most minority contracting firms are capped in the size of a contract they can get, but the ANCs, as they're called, the Alaskan Natives, don't have a cap. That was a measure that Senator Ted Stevens implemented over the years when he was representing Alaska.
Before he was indicted.
Yeah, well, his career ends in a contracting scandal. Anyway, I hope you get a chance to see the story on the California Watch website and the Chronicle. It's really a story about how federal contracts actually are led, and maybe it's also a story about how even well-intentioned programs and really good projects can wind up costing taxpayers a fortune.
But the idea was to widen the channel so that the debris doesn't mount up and flood the area, which has been flooded year after year, time after time, and in recent years they've done these flood control projects that have helped a lot. I mean, the real idea here was not to service the wine train, but to widen a channel so that the flooding would stop.
Well, the real idea is you're moving the bridges that the train uses. You're building a wall around their station. You have to do it because under the plan you're accommodating this business. Other businesses were eminent domained out of existence. They wanted to keep this one.
So this is not stimulus money.
Oh, it is
$54
million.
And so how many jobs are being created?
Well, that's the thing. In the report that the Alaska Native Corporation filed with the federal government, they said they were creating 12 jobs. The flood control district says that's just a preliminary number and they're going to do a lot better than that, maybe a couple of hundred jobs.
Is the money being misused?
I don't think the money's being misused at all. I think the real questions and the appropriate questions are whether they're paying a premium to go this route with a no-bid contract in which subcontractors are doing like 65% of the actual work.
So we start out with $54 million. It goes out to bid. It ends up in Alaska. And then who's running the whole project?
Well, the CEO is a former dot-com entrepreneur who lives in South Carolina. He doesn't actually have construction experience. The company hasn't ever done a big project like this, so it is subbed out to really good, solid local contractors. You know, we talked to a contractor actually who had done a prior phase of the flood control project and got a design award. He's convinced that by not putting it out to bid, it cost us an arm and a leg. So,
this was one of the 100 or so projects that John McCain and Senator Coburn from Oklahoma singled out as being boondoggles when they looked at the stimulus projects. Does it deserve to be on that list, do you think?
Well, it deserves scrutiny. The people in Napa were aggrieved by the criticism. They thought if the critics were suggesting that someone had written a check to the wine train, and of course that's not what's going on, but it's totally appropriate to scrutinize how we're spending this fortune.
Yeah, $54 million up in Napa someplace. Thank you so much. In fact, thanks to all of you. Thanks you, Lawrence. Thank you very much, Scott, and to Tom and John.